Blood stained the wooden floorboards in a pattern that looked like a macabre painting, spreading outward from the man who lay sprawled on his back, his breathing shallow and labored. Felicity Chandler stood frozen in the doorway of the small cabin, the basket of fresh bread and preserves she had brought now forgotten at her feet, her heart hammering in her chest like a wild mustang trying to break free. The year was 1876, and the Montana Territory was still raw and untamed, a place where death came as easily as the changing seasons. But Felicity had not expected to find death waiting in the cabin of the man who had kept mostly to himself since arriving in Whispering Pines 6 months ago. "Mr. Ellis," she called, her voice a trembling whisper as she finally willed her feet to move forward. Frederick Ellis, known to most simply as the quiet cowboy, lay on the rough-hewn wooden floor, his Colt revolver beside his outstretched hand. A dark crimson stain bloomed across his shirt just below his rib cage, and his tanned face had taken on an alarming pallor. Felicity rushed to his side, her skirts sweeping across the floor as she knelt beside him. Her hands hovered above his wound, uncertain, as her training as the town's only midwife had never prepared her for bullet wounds. She pressed her palm against his chest, feeling the faint rhythm of his heart. His eyelids fluttered, revealing eyes the color of a summer sky. Recognition dawned in them as they focused on her face. "Miss Chandler," he rasped, his voice barely audible, "bad timing for a social call." "You're not dying like this," she said firmly, tearing at the hem of her petticoat to create a makeshift bandage. "Not on this dirty floor with no one but me to hear your last words." A ghost of a smile crossed his lips. "Wouldn't be such a bad way to go." "Hush now," Felicity ordered, pressing the fabric against his wound. "Save your strength. Who did this to you?" Frederick's eyes closed briefly, his face contorting in pain. "Barton's men, they finally found me." Felicity's hands stilled momentarily. Everyone in town knew of the Barton gang, ruthless outlaws who had been terrorizing the territory for years. "Why would they come after you?" "Long story," he murmured, his breath coming in short gasps now. "One I might tell you if you keep me alive." "That's a promise," Felicity said, determination hardening her voice as she reached for a nearby canteen to clean his wound. "And I always keep my promises, Mr. Ellis." She worked quickly, cleaning the wound as best she could in the dim light of the cabin. The bullet had entered his side but thankfully appeared to have missed vital organs. Still, the amount of blood was concerning and she knew she needed help. "I need to get you to doctor." "Morrison," she said, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her hand. "But I can't move you alone." Frederick's fingers weakly circled her wrist. "No doctor, they'll be watching." "Who will be watching?" "The Barton gang," he nodded, his grip tightening slightly. "Can't risk your safety." Felicity felt a flutter in her chest at his concern, despite his own dire situation. She had always found Frederick Ellis intriguing from the moment he arrived in town, his quiet demeanor and solitary habits setting him apart from the boisterous cowboys who frequented the saloon. There was a depth to his blue eyes that spoke of experiences beyond the typical ranch hand, and a gentleness to his manner that contradicted his weathered appearance. "My safety is not your concern right now," she told him firmly. "But I understand about the doctor. I'll need to treat you here." She glanced around the sparse cabin. A small table with 2 chairs, a narrow bed against the far wall, a pot-bellied stove, and shelves containing minimal provisions. At least it was clean, unlike many bachelor accommodations she had seen. "I need to get you to the bed," she said, assessing the situation. "Can you help me at all if I support you?" Frederick gritted his teeth and nodded. With considerable effort and muffled groans of pain, Felicity managed to help him to his feet and guide him the few steps to the bed. By the time he was settled, his face had grown even paler, and fresh blood seeped through her makeshift bandage. "I need to remove the bullet," she said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. She had assisted Dr. Morrison with similar procedures but had never performed one alone. "I'll need your hunting knife and some whiskey if you have it." Frederick gestured weakly toward a trunk at the foot of the bed. Felicity quickly located the knife, a bottle of whiskey, and a clean shirt she could tear for bandages. She poured some of the amber liquid onto the blade, then held the bottle to Frederick's lips. "Drink," she instructed. This will hurt. He took several long swallows, then nodded, his jaw set in grim determination. Do what you must, Miss Chandler. Felicity took a deep breath to steady her hands. My name is Felicity, she said softly. I think we're well past formalities, Mr. Ellis. Frederick, he replied, a faint smile touching his lips despite the pain, or Fred to the few I call friends. Well, Frederick, she said, cutting away his blood-soaked shirt, I hope you'll count me among those few after today. The bullet extraction was a gruesome affair, with Frederick biting down on a folded piece of leather to muffle his cries. Felicity worked methodically, her hands steadier than she had expected, finally retrieving the small lead projectile that had nearly ended his life. She cleaned the wound thoroughly, with whiskey earning more muffled groans from her patient before stitching it closed with needle and thread from her sewing kit and applying a clean bandage. By the time she finished, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the cabin floor. Frederick had passed out from the pain, which was perhaps a mercy. Felicity sat beside him on a wooden chair she had pulled next to the bed, bathing his face with cool water to combat the fever that had begun to take hold. As darkness fell, she realized she couldn't leave him. Not only was he in no condition to defend himself if the Barton gang returned, but the fever would need careful monitoring through the night. She moved quietly around the cabin, lighting a lantern and stoking the fire in the stove to ward off the spring evening's chill. She found paper and a pencil and quickly wrote a note to her neighbor, Mrs. Holloway, explaining that she had been called to tend to a patient and would be away overnight. She slipped outside briefly, whistling softly for her horse, which had been tethered near the cabin. Attaching the note to the saddle, she gave the mare a gentle slap on the flank, sending her trotting back toward town. Mrs. Holloway would find the horse and the note, and while she might worry, she wouldn't raise an alarm. Back inside, Felicity prepared a simple broth from the few provisions in Frederick's cupboard. As she worked, her mind turned over what little she knew about the man lying in the bed. Frederick Ellis had appeared in Whispering Pines last autumn, taking a job at the Carter Ranch as a wrangler. He kept to himself, visiting town only for supplies and occasional meals at the boarding house where she lived and worked. He was unfailingly polite but revealed little about his past. Now, with the mention of the Barton gang, she wondered what secrets lay behind those summer sky eyes. As if sensing her thoughts, Frederick stirred, his eyelids fluttering open. He seemed disoriented at first, then focused on her face. "You're still here," he murmured, surprise evident in his voice. "Did you think I would patch you up and leave you to fend for yourself?" She asked, moving to sit beside him again. "I'm not quite that heartless." "Not heartless at all," he replied, his voice stronger than before. "Just sensible, which would be to stay away from a man with a price on his head." Felicity raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you have, a price on your head?" Frederick sighed, shifting slightly and wincing at the movement. "In a manner of speaking, the Barton gang doesn't forget those who cross them." "And you crossed them?" He was quiet for a moment, studying her face as if weighing how much to reveal. "I was a marshal in Colorado," he finally said. "I helped bring in 2 of Jacob Barton's brothers 3 years ago. They were hanged for murder." Felicity's eyes widened. She had suspected he might have been running from the law, not that he had been the law. "That explains why you're so handy with that gun," she said, nodding toward the Colt revolver she had placed on the table. A wry smile crossed his face. "Not handy enough today, it seems. How many were there?" 3. "I got 2 of them, but the third got lucky." His expression darkened. "They'll be back with more men. Jacob Barton doesn't let go of a grudge. Is that why you came here, to hide?" Frederick nodded, the movement causing him to grimace. "I resigned my badge after the hangings. Too many threats against my family back east. I figured if I disappeared, the Bartons would focus their vengeance on me alone. But they found you anyway," Felicity said softly. "It was only a matter of time. I've been moving from place to place for 3 years." His eyes met hers, filled with regret. "I should have moved on from here sooner, but I found reasons to stay." Something in his gaze made Felicity's heart beat faster. Could she have been one of those reasons? They had spoken only a handful of times since his arrival, yet she had felt an inexplicable connection to him from their first meeting. "Whispering Pines is a good town," she said, breaking eye contact to check his bandage. With good people. Yes, he agreed, his hand capturing hers as she adjusted the bandage. Very good people. His touch sent warmth up her arm, and she found herself reluctant to pull away. Instead, she allowed her hand to remain in his for a moment longer than necessary. You need to eat something, she said finally, gently extracting her hand. I made broth. As she helped him sit up enough to sip the warm liquid, Felicity's mind raced with the implications of what he had told her. If the Barton gang was coming back, the entire town could be in danger. Yet going for help meant exposing Frederick's presence to those who might be watching. What will you do now? She asked once he had finished the broth. You can't travel in your condition. I've been in worse situations, he said, though his pale face belied his confident words. Once I can ride, I'll move on, draw them away from here. And go where? How long will you keep running? Frederick closed his eyes briefly. As long as I have to. Felicity shook her head, frustration building in her chest. There must be another way. What about contacting the territorial marshal? Surely they could help protect you and bring the Bartons to justice. The nearest marshal is 2 days' ride from here, Frederick pointed out, and sending word would only alert the Bartons that I'm still alive. So your plan is to just disappear again. Keep moving from town to town until they eventually catch up to you again or worse. His jaw tightened. I don't see much choice, Felicity. The sound of her name on his lips sent an unexpected thrill through her. There's always a choice, she insisted. And I don't accept that yours is between dying alone or putting others at risk. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. You're rather stubborn, aren't you? So I've been told, she replied, lifting her chin. Usually by people who later thank me for it. Frederick's smile widened slightly, bringing a hint of color back to his face. I can see why. Their eyes held for a long moment, and Felicity felt something shift between them, a deepening of the connection that had been merely a spark before. She broke away first, suddenly aware of how improper her situation was, alone in a man's cabin for the night. Yet propriety seemed a distant concern compared to saving his life. You should rest, she said, rising from the chair. The more sleep you get, the faster you'll heal. And where will you sleep? He asked, his eyes taking in the cabin's sparse furnishings. I'll be fine in the chair, she assured him. I've fallen asleep in less comfortable places while attending births. Frederick frowned. Take the bed, I can manage on the floor with some blankets. Absolutely not, Felicity said firmly. You've lost too much blood to be anywhere but that bed. Don't argue with me, Frederick Ellis. I'm as stubborn about my patient's welfare as I am about everything else. To her surprise, he chuckled softly. I don't doubt it. Very well, I surrender to your superior stubbornness. Felicity arranged the chair near the stove for warmth, using one of Frederick's spare blankets to make herself as comfortable as possible. She extinguished the lantern but left the stove door slightly ajar, casting a soft orange glow across the cabin. Felicity, Frederick's voice came softly through the darkness after a few minutes of silence. Yes, thank you not just for the doctoring but for caring what happens next. His words touched something deep within her. Get some sleep, Frederick. We'll figure out what happens next in the morning. But sleep proved elusive for Felicity as she sat in the dimly lit cabin, listening to Frederick's breathing gradually even out as he drifted off. Her mind whirled with the day's events and the revelations about the quiet cowboy who was actually a former marshal with dangerous enemies. She had come to Whispering Pines 3 years ago, following the death of her parents in a St. Louis epidemic. With no siblings and only distant relatives who viewed her as a burden, she had answered an advertisement seeking a midwife for the growing frontier town. The position came with room and board at Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, and Felicity had quickly established herself as both competent and compassionate. At 26, she had resigned herself to spinsterhood, focusing on her work rather than the limited marriage prospects in the small town. The few eligible men either treated her with wary respect due to her education and independent nature, or saw her merely as a stepping stone to respectability. None had stirred her heart the way the wounded man across the room had done with just a few meaningful glances. The irony that she should find herself drawn to a man who would likely be gone as soon as he could ride was not lost on her. Yet as she watched the gentle rise and fall of his chest in the fading glow from the stove, Felicity felt a fierce protectiveness that went beyond professional concern for a patient. She must have dozed off eventually, for she awoke with a start to the sound of Frederick thrashing in the bed, caught in the grip of a fever dream. "No, get back," he muttered, his voice tight with distress. "Behind me, take cover." Felicity hurried to his side, alarmed by the heat radiating from his skin as she placed her palm on his forehead. The fever she had feared had taken hold with a vengeance. "Frederick," she called softly, wetting a cloth from the water pitcher and placing it on his brow. "You're safe." "It's just a dream." His eyes snapped open, wild and unfocused. "They're coming, you need to run." "No one is coming right now," she soothed, wiping his face with the cool cloth, "and I'm not going anywhere." For hours, she battled his fever, alternating between cool compresses and spoonfuls of water mixed with willow bark tea she found among her supplies. As dawn approached, his temperature finally began to subside, and he fell into a deeper, more restful sleep. Exhausted but relieved, Felicity sank back into the chair she had pulled beside the bed. She must have fallen asleep again, for the next thing she knew, sunlight was streaming through the cabin windows, and Frederick was watching her with clear blue eyes. "You look like you had a rougher night than I did," he said softly. Felicity straightened, embarrassed to realize she had been sleeping with her head resting on the edge of his bed. "Your fever broke, at least," she said, touching his forehead to confirm that his temperature had indeed returned to normal. "How do you feel?" "Like I was trampled by a herd of wild mustangs," he admitted with a wry smile, "but considerably more alive than I expected to be yesterday." "The wound doesn't appear infected," she said, carefully checking the bandage. "But you've lost a lot of blood. You need rest and nourishment to regain your strength." Frederick caught her hand as she adjusted the bandage. "Felicity, you can't stay here. It's not safe and it's not proper." "Proper?" she repeated, raising an eyebrow. "I think we're well past concerns of propriety, Frederick. Your reputation is the least of my worries right now," she interrupted. "But you're right that I can't stay indefinitely. I need to return to town for more supplies and to assure Mrs. Holloway that I'm still alive. And what will you tell her, or anyone else who asks where you've been?" Felicity considered for a moment. "That I was called to tend a trapper's wife at her remote cabin. It's happened before and no one will question it." Frederick didn't look convinced. "And if Barton's men are watching the town, they could follow you back here. They think you're dead, remember?" she pointed out. "Why would they watch the town now, to make sure?" he said grimly. "Jacob Barton is thorough," Felicity sighed, acknowledging the truth in his words. "Then I'll be careful. I'll take a circuitous route back and watch for anyone following me." Frederick's expression remained troubled, but he nodded. "Be back before dark. If you're not, I'll assume something's wrong and—" He trailed off, glancing at his gun on the table. "And what?" "Drag yourself into town on a half-dead horse to rescue me?" she asked, unable to keep the exasperation from her voice. "You can barely sit up in bed." A flash of frustration crossed his face. "I don't like putting you in danger because of me." "I put myself in danger," she reminded him gently. "I chose to help you and I'm choosing to continue helping you. That's my decision." Their eyes held for a long moment before Frederick finally nodded. "Just be careful," he said softly. "I couldn't bear it if something happened to you because of me." The intensity in his gaze sent a warmth spreading through Felicity's chest. "I will be," she promised. "Now, let me change your bandage before I go." After ensuring Frederick was as comfortable as possible with water and some jerky within reach, Felicity prepared to leave. She had found Frederick's mare in the small corral behind the cabin, seemingly unharmed despite yesterday's violence. "I'll be back by mid-afternoon," she told him, pausing at the door. "Try to rest and don't do anything foolish like trying to get up." "Yes, madam," he replied with a mock salute, though the effort of raising his arm made him wince. "I mean it, Frederick," she said, her voice serious now. "You've been given a second chance, don't waste it through stubbornness." His expression softened. "I won't, I have too much to live for now." The words followed Felicity as she rode toward town, her mind filled with conflicting emotions. The connection growing between them was undeniable, yet so were the dangers surrounding Frederick. How could there be any future for them when he might need to flee at any moment? Whispering Pines appeared peaceful in the late morning sun, its single dusty street lined with the familiar buildings that had become home to Felicity. The general store, the blacksmith's forge, the small church, and at the far end, the Pride of Montana Saloon, which served as the social hub for the predominantly male population. Mrs. Holloway's boarding house stood near the center of town, a two-story white clapboard building with green shutters and a wide front porch. Felicity tied Frederick's mare at the hitching post and tried to compose herself before entering. She had rehearsed her story on the ride in, but still felt a flutter of anxiety at the deception. The moment she stepped through the door, Mrs. Holloway emerged from the kitchen, her round face a mixture of relief and concern. "Felicity, thank heavens you're all right. Your horse came back without you last night and I've been worried sick." Felicity accepted the older woman's embrace, guilt twinging at her conscience. "I'm sorry to have worried you. There was a trapper's wife in labor at a cabin north of here. Complicated birth, I had to stay the night." Mrs. Holloway studied her face. "You look exhausted, dear. Was the mother all right? The baby? Both doing well now," Felicity said, the lies coming more easily than she'd expected. "But I need to return with more supplies. I promised I'd check on them again today." Of course, Mrs. Holloway nodded. "But you must eat something first. You're pale as a ghost." Felicity gratefully accepted the bowl of stew and thick slice of bread Mrs. Holloway provided, realizing she hadn't eaten since the previous morning. As she ate, she carefully asked if there had been any unusual visitors in town. "Just the usual freighters and cowhands," Mrs. Holloway said, pouring her a cup of coffee. "Though there was some excitement at the saloon last night, 3 strangers got into a fight with some of the Carter Ranch hands. Sheriff Hayes threw them in jail to cool off." Felicity's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "What sort of strangers? Rough-looking types," Mrs. Holloway replied, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Not the usual cowboys passing through. Mr. Jenkins at the Mercantile said they were asking about a man matching Frederick Ellis's description earlier in the day." Felicity's heart pounded, but she kept her expression neutral. "How strange. I wonder what they wanted with him. Who knows? Mr. Ellis keeps to himself so much, it's hard to imagine he has many acquaintances looking for him." Mrs. Holloway shrugged. "Anyway, Sheriff Hayes will likely release them this morning if they've sobered up." This news added urgency to Felicity's mission. If Barton's men were in jail, this might be her only chance to gather supplies and return to the cabin without being followed. After finishing her meal, she quickly packed a basket with food from Mrs. Holloway's kitchen, promising to replace it all when she returned. She then visited her room to collect her medical supplies before heading to the Mercantile for additional bandages and medicines. As she was leaving the store, she nearly collided with Sheriff Hayes, a graying man with a perpetually weary expression. "Miss Chandler," he greeted her, tipping his hat. "Mrs. Holloway mentioned you were back in town. Successful delivery, I hope?" "Yes, thank you, Sheriff," she replied, trying not to appear rushed. "Both mother and baby are doing well." The sheriff nodded, then lowered his voice. "I was hoping to ask you something. Those troublemakers I locked up last night, they were asking about Ellis before the fight started. You wouldn't happen to know why anyone would be looking for him, would you?" Felicity's heart skipped a beat, but she maintained her composure. "I'm afraid I wouldn't know, Sheriff. Mr. Ellis and I are hardly acquainted." Hayes studied her for a moment. "Well, if you do see him, tell him to be careful. Those men didn't strike me as the friendly sort. I let them go this morning and they headed north out of town." North in the direction of Frederick's cabin, Felicity felt a chill run down her spine. "I'll certainly pass that along if I see him," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady. "If you'll excuse me, Sheriff, I need to get back to my patient." She hurried to Frederick's mare, securing her supplies and mounting quickly. As she rode out of town, she fought the urge to gallop, knowing it would draw attention. Only when Whispering Pines was well behind her did she urge the horse to a faster pace, taking a circuitous route through the foothills to approach the cabin from the west instead of the north. As she neared, a sense of foreboding grew stronger. The cabin appeared quiet, too quiet. No smoke rose from the chimney despite the cool spring air. Felicity dismounted at a distance, tethering the mare to a tree and approaching on foot, her heart pounding in her ears. She crept to the window, peering cautiously inside. The cabin appeared empty, the bed where she had left Frederick now vacant, blankets thrown aside. A fresh bloodstain on the sheets told her he had reopened his wound, likely by moving too quickly. "Frederick," she called softly, pushing open the door. The cabin was indeed empty, but signs of a hasty departure were evident. Frederick's saddlebags were gone, as were his gun, belt, and rifle. On the table lay a folded piece of paper with her name written on it. With trembling fingers, Felicity unfolded the note. "Felicity, Sheriff Hayes came by after you left. Barton's men have been released and were seen heading this way. I can't risk them finding you here. I'm heading into the high country to draw them away from town and from you. Please don't follow. Your safety means more to me than I can express in these few words. Know that these past months, watching you from afar, have given me a glimpse of a life I thought was forever beyond my reach. For that alone, I owe you a debt I can never repay. Be safe. Be happy." Frederick, tears blurred Felicity's vision as she read the note a second time. The fool. In his condition, he wouldn't make it far before his wound reopened completely, and facing 3 armed men alone, weakened as he was, would be suicide. "Not if I have anything to say about it," she muttered, crushing the note in her fist. Felicity moved quickly, gathering the supplies she had brought and stuffing them into a small pack. From Frederick's trunk, she retrieved a hunting knife and slipped it into her boot. Then, with determination hardening her resolve, she mounted the mare and urged her toward the rocky trails leading into the mountains. Frederick couldn't have more than a couple of hours' head start, and in his condition, he would be moving slowly. If she could find him before Barton's men did, perhaps there was still a chance to save him from his enemies and from himself. The trail into the mountains was steep and treacherous in places, forcing Felicity to proceed more cautiously than she would have liked. She searched for signs of Frederick's passage, finding occasional marks that suggested a horse had recently traveled this way. As the afternoon wore on, dark clouds gathered overhead, promising rain that would make tracking even more difficult. Felicity pushed on, driven by a fear that clawed at her heart each time she imagined Frederick facing his enemies alone, wounded and weakening by the hour. The first drops of rain began to fall as she reached a plateau overlooking a narrow valley. In the distance, she spotted a plume of smoke rising from a stand of pines, a campfire, hastily made and poorly concealed. Either Frederick was getting careless, or a gunshot echoed across the valley, followed by 2 more in rapid succession. Felicity's blood ran cold. Spurring her horse forward, she raced toward the sound, heedless now of the danger to herself. The scene that greeted her as she broke through the trees sent ice through her veins. Frederick was using his horse as cover, his face ashen as he clutched his side where fresh blood stained his shirt. Across the small clearing, 2 men crouched behind boulders, their guns trained on Frederick's position. A third man lay motionless on the ground, evidence that despite his condition, Frederick had managed to take at least one of his attackers with him. Neither of the remaining gunmen had noticed Felicity's arrival, their attention focused entirely on Frederick. She dismounted silently, tethering her horse well back from the clearing. The knife in her boot suddenly seemed woefully inadequate, but it was her only weapon. She needed a distraction, something to draw their attention away from Frederick long enough for him to either escape or gain the upper hand. Her eyes fell on a pile of loose stones near the edge of the clearing. It wasn't much, but it might be enough. Taking a deep breath, Felicity gathered several of the larger stones and crept around the perimeter of the clearing until she was positioned behind the gunmen. Then, with all her strength, she hurled one of the rocks into the trees far to their right. The resulting crash had the desired effect. Both men turned toward the sound, one of them rising slightly from his position behind the boulder. "What was that?" one called to the other. "You think there's more of them? Check it out," the other ordered. "I'll keep him pinned down." The first man rose cautiously, his gun trained on the trees where the sound had originated. Felicity held her breath, waiting until he had moved several paces away from his companion before throwing another rock. this time to the left of the clearing. The confusion that followed gave Frederick the opening he needed. With remarkable speed for a wounded man, he raised his rifle and fired twice. The gunman who had remained by the boulder cried out, clutching his shoulder as he fell. The second man whirled back toward Frederick, but Felicity was already moving. With a courage born of desperation, she charged from her hiding place, knife in hand. She didn't intend to use it, couldn't imagine actually stabbing someone, but the sudden appearance of an armed woman from behind was enough to startle the gunman. His moment of hesitation was all Frederick needed. Another shot rang out, and the man collapsed, his gun falling from nerveless fingers. The clearing fell silent except for the soft patter of rain and the labored breathing of the wounded. Felicity stood frozen for a heartbeat, the reality of what had just occurred washing over her. Then Frederick's hoarse voice broke the spell. "Felicity, what in God's name are you doing here?" She rushed to his side where he had slumped against his horse's flank, his face gray with exhaustion and pain. "Saving your life, apparently," she replied, her voice shakier than she would have liked, "though I seem to be making a habit of it." Frederick's laugh turned into a grimace of pain. "I told you not to follow me, and I decided not to listen," she said, already examining his wound. The bandage was soaked through with blood and his shirt clung to his skin, damp with both rain and sweat. "Your stitches have torn. You're lucky you didn't bleed to death before they found you." "Lucky?" he repeated, his eyes holding hers. "Yes, I suppose I am, though my luck seems to be of a particular kind lately, the kind that brings beautiful, stubborn women into gunfights." Despite everything, Felicity felt her cheeks warm at his words. "We need to get you somewhere dry and safe." "I can restitch your wound, but not here in the open." Frederick nodded toward the fallen gunmen. "We should check them first, make sure they're not a threat." Felicity swallowed hard but moved to do as he suggested. The man Frederick had shot first was dead, a bullet through his chest. The second was alive but unconscious, blood seeping from a wound in his shoulder. "This one's still breathing," she called, her midwife's training taking over as she pressed a folded bandana against the wound to slow the bleeding. "Leave him," Frederick said, his voice hard. "He wouldn't have shown you the same mercy." Felicity looked up, meeting Frederick's gaze across the clearing. "I'm not him," she said simply. "And neither are you, not anymore." Something shifted in Frederick's expression, respect, perhaps, or a deeper understanding. He nodded slowly. "We can't take him with us." "No, but we can give him a fighting chance," she replied, quickly binding the man's wound with strips torn from his own shirt. "Whether he deserves it or not." Working together, they managed to get Frederick onto his horse. Felicity collected both their weapons. She wasn't going to leave guns for the wounded man to use when he regained consciousness, and mounted her own horse. With a final glance at the clearing that had nearly become Frederick's last stand, they rode out, heading not back toward Whispering Pines but deeper into the mountains. "There's an old trapper's cabin about 3 miles north of here," Frederick said, his voice strained as he fought to remain upright in the saddle. "Used it once last winter, should be abandoned this time of year." Felicity rode close beside him, ready to catch him if he started to fall. "Can you stay on your horse that long?" "I'll have to," he replied grimly. "Can't exactly ask Barton's man back there for help." The rain continued to fall as they made their way through the increasingly dense forest. Twice Frederick nearly slipped from his saddle, and by the time the small, dilapidated cabin came into view, he was barely conscious, held upright only by Felicity's arm around his waist. The cabin was little more than a one-room shack with a sagging roof and a stone fireplace, but it was dry and relatively clean inside. Felicity helped Frederick to the single narrow cot while she quickly built a fire in the hearth. "Your bedside manner has improved since yesterday," Frederick murmured as she helped him remove his sodden shirt to examine his wound. "And your ability to follow instructions has not," she replied tartly, though there was no real anger in her voice, only relief that he was still alive to tease her. "What were you thinking, trying to ride out in your condition?" "That I was protecting you," he said, his blue eyes suddenly serious. "That I couldn't bear it if you were hurt because of me." Felicity's hands stilled on his bandage. "And did it occur to you that I might feel the same way about you?" Their eyes held for a long moment, the air between them charged with unspoken emotions. Then Frederick winced as she resumed cleaning his wound, breaking the spell. "I've spent 3 years running, Felicity," he said quietly as she prepared to restitch the torn flesh. "Keeping everyone at a distance. Not allowing myself to care too much about anyone or anything. It seemed the only way to keep others safe." "And has it worked?" she asked, threading a needle with catgut. "Has it made you happy or even truly safe?" Frederick was silent as she began to sew, his jaw clenched against the pain. Only when she had finished and was applying a fresh bandage did he speak again. "No," he admitted. "It's no way to live, but I didn't see any other choice." Felicity sat back, studying his face in the flickering firelight. "There's always a choice, Frederick. Always." Outside, the rain had intensified, drumming on the cabin roof and turning the world beyond the single small window into a gray blur. They were effectively trapped here, at least until morning, and the intimacy of their situation was not lost on either of them. Felicity busied herself preparing a simple meal from the supplies she had brought, grateful for the distraction. Frederick watched her move about the cabin, his expression thoughtful. "You saved my life again today," he said as she handed him a tin cup of broth. "Not many women or men, for that matter, would have followed an armed fugitive into a gunfight." "I'm not many women," she replied with a small smile. "As you may have noticed." "Oh, I've noticed," he said softly. "From the first day I saw you in town, tending to that miner's broken arm outside the general store, you were so confident, so present, everyone else seemed to fade into the background." Felicity felt heat rise to her cheeks, remembering the day well. She had noticed him too, the quiet stranger watching from the boardwalk with those intense blue eyes. "Is that why you always seem to appear at Mrs. Holloway's for dinner on the nights I was serving?" A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Was I that obvious?" "Only to me," she assured him. "Mrs. Holloway was convinced you had a fondness for her apple pie." "Well, her pie is exceptional," Frederick conceded, "but not as compelling as the company." The simple admission hung in the air between them, more meaningful than any flowery declaration could have been. Felicity felt something unfurl in her chest, a tender hope she had not allowed herself to acknowledge until now. "What happens next?" she asked, settling beside him on a rough wooden stool. "Barton will know you're alive now. He'll send more men," Frederick sighed, setting aside his empty cup. "I can't keep running forever, and today proved I can't outfight them either, not anymore. So what's the alternative?" He was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the dancing flames in the hearth. "There's a U.S. Marshal in Helena I know from my days with the badge. Honest man. If I could reach him, tell him what's happening. Maybe he could help end this once and for all." "Helena is at least a week's ride," Felicity pointed out. "You're in no condition to travel that far." "No, but a letter might reach him. If I could get word to him about Barton's men operating in this territory, he might come with enough deputies to make a difference." Felicity considered this. "Sheriff Hayes seemed concerned when he mentioned the men asking about you. He might be willing to help send a message." "It's a risk," Frederick said. "We don't know who in town might be sympathetic to Barton. The gang is known for paying for information." "Hayes is a good man," Felicity insisted. "I've known him for 3 years. He wouldn't betray you." Frederick studied her face, then nodded slowly. "I trust your judgment, but we're still trapped here until morning at least, and I can't very well ride back into town in this condition." "No," she agreed, "but I can. Once I'm sure you're stable, I'll return to Whispering Pines and speak to Hayes myself." Frederick reached for her hand, his fingers warm despite his weakened state. "You've already risked too much for me, Felicity. I can't ask you to do more." "You're not asking," she said simply. "I'm offering." His thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, sending a pleasant shiver up her arm. "Why?" he asked softly. "Why risk everything for a man you barely know?" Felicity met his gaze steadily. "Because sometimes you know a person's heart without needing years of acquaintance. Sometimes a few meaningful moments tell you more than a lifetime of casual encounters." Frederick's eyes darkened with emotion. Slowly, as if giving her time to pull away, he raised his free hand to her cheek, his calloused palm gentle against her skin. "And what does my heart tell you, Felicity Chandler?" She leaned slightly into his touch. That you're a good man who has carried a heavy burden alone for too long. That beneath the quiet exterior is someone who cares deeply, perhaps too deeply for his own good. And that you're as drawn to me as I am to you, despite all the reasons we should keep our distance. His smile was tender as his thumb brushed across her cheekbone. All true. Though you forgot to mention that I'm also stubborn, occasionally foolhardy, and entirely unworthy of the care you've shown me. I'll be the judge of that, she whispered, and then, throwing caution to the winds, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but quickly deepened as Frederick's arm slipped around her waist, drawing her closer. When they finally parted, both were breathing more rapidly, and the air between them seemed charged with possibility. I've wanted to do that since the first time I saw you, Frederick admitted, his voice husky. Even covered in dirt and blood, tending to a miner's broken arm, she asked with a soft laugh. Especially then, he said, tucking a strand of her chestnut hair behind her ear. You were magnificent, competent, and compassionate all at once. Felicity felt a blush warm her cheeks. No one had ever described her as magnificent before. Capable, yes. Practical, certainly, but never in such admiring terms. You need to rest, she said, reluctantly pulling back slightly. You've lost too much blood to be engaging in activities that increase your heart rate. Frederick's laugh was warm and genuine, lighting his eyes in a way she hadn't seen before. Is that your professional opinion, Miss Chandler? It is indeed, Mr. Ellis, she replied primly, though her own heart was racing. Doctor's orders. Well, I suppose I should follow them this time, he conceded, since ignoring your last set of instructions nearly got me killed. Felicity arranged the blankets more comfortably around him, then moved to add more wood to the fire. The rain continued to drum on the roof, creating a cozy cocoon that separated them from the dangers waiting beyond the cabin walls. As night fell, Felicity found herself sharing the narrow cot with Frederick, her back pressed against his uninjured side, his arm draped protectively around her waist. It was scandalously improper and yet felt more right than anything she had ever known. What will you do when this is over? She asked softly into the darkness. If the marshal comes and deals with Barton's gang, will you move on again? Frederick's breath was warm against her hair. I've been thinking about that, about what you said that there's always a choice. And his arm tightened slightly around her waist. And I'm tired of running. Tired of not having a home or people to care about. If there's a chance I could stay in one place in Whispering Pines, I'd take it. Felicity turned in his embrace, careful not to jostle his wound until she was facing him. In the dim glow from the banked fire, his features were softened, the hard lines of worry temporarily eased. What would you do here? She asked. Go back to being a lawman, Frederick shook his head. No, I'm done with that life. The Carter Ranch has good land to the east that the owner's looking to sell. I've been saving my wages. It's not much, but it might be enough for a small spread of my own. A rancher, Felicity said, picturing him on his own land, building something permanent. It suits you. It would suit me better with a partner, he said quietly, his eyes searching hers. Someone to share the work and the rewards. Felicity's heart skipped a beat. That sounds like a proposal, Frederick Ellis. Maybe it is, he replied, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. Or maybe it's just a man thinking aloud about possibilities he never dared consider before. Well, she said, her own smile matching his, when you decide which it is, I'll be here to listen. His kiss was her only answer, a promise wrapped in tenderness that spoke more eloquently than words. Eventually, they both drifted into sleep, the sound of rain and the warmth of shared hope cocooning them against the uncertainties that awaited with the dawn. Morning broke clear and bright, the storm having passed in the night. Felicity woke first, carefully disentangling herself from Frederick's embrace to check his wound. The fresh stitches had held, and while he was still pale from blood loss, his skin was cool to the touch, no sign of returning fever. She slipped outside to fetch water from the nearby stream, returning to find Frederick awake and attempting to sit up. Slowly, she cautioned, setting down the bucket to help him. You'll tear your stitches again. I feel stronger today, he said, though the effort of sitting upright left him slightly breathless. Strong enough to ride if we take it slow, Felicity frowned. I still think you should stay here while I go back to town. It's safer. For whom? He asked with a raised eyebrow. You riding alone, or me sitting here like a trapped fox waiting for Barton's men to pick up our trail? She had to admit he had a point. Fine, but we go together and we go carefully, and you let me do the talking when we reach town. Frederick agreed, and after a simple breakfast, they prepared to leave the small cabin that had sheltered them through the night. As Frederick gingerly mounted his horse, Felicity felt a pang of worry. He was putting on a brave face, but she could see the pain in the tightness around his eyes, the careful way he held himself. We'll take the long way around, she decided, studying the terrain. Avoid the clearing where those men were. Frederick nodded, his expression grim. The surviving one will have made his way back to Barton by now. They'll be looking for us. The journey back toward Whispering Pines was slow and tense, every snapping twig or bird call causing them to freeze and listen for pursuit. By midday, they had reached the foothills, where the trees thinned enough to give them a view of the valley below. Smoke rose peacefully from chimneys in the distance, the town appearing as tranquil as ever. Seems quiet, Felicity said, scanning the landscape for any sign of riders. Too quiet, Frederick muttered. I don't like it. They approached town from the west, using a seldom-traveled trail that wound through a rocky ravine before emerging behind the livery stable. The stable boy, a freckle-faced youth named Timothy, looked up in surprise as they rode in. Miss Chandler and Mr. Ellis, you're back. Everyone's been looking for you. Frederick tensed, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. Who's been looking? Timothy's eyes widened at Frederick's tone. Sheriff Hayes, madam. He came by Mrs. Holloway's last night asking where you might have gone. Said it was urgent. Felicity exchanged a glance with Frederick. Did he say why? The boy shook his head. No, madam, just that he needed to find you right away, and then this morning those strangers were asking about you too. What strangers? Frederick demanded, his voice sharp. 4 men rode in at dawn, Timothy said nervously. Rough-looking types, been hanging around the saloon most of the morning. Felicity's heart sank. Barton had sent reinforcements. Timothy, I need you to do something for me. Can you run to Sheriff Hayes and tell him we're here, but that we need to see him privately? Ask him to come to the back entrance of the livery. The boy nodded eagerly, clearly excited to be part of something important. Yes, madam. As Timothy dashed off, Frederick dismounted carefully, grimacing with the effort. If Barton's men are in town, we've brought trouble to your doorstep. Trouble was already here, she pointed out, helping him to a bench inside the stable. At least now we have a chance to end it. They waited in tense silence, Frederick's hand never straying far from his gun. When the stable door creaked open 10 minutes later, both started, relaxing only when Sheriff Hayes's familiar figure appeared. Miss Chandler, he greeted her, his weathered face creased with concern. And Ellis. Good to see you both in one piece, more or less. His sharp eyes took in Frederick's pale complexion and the bloodstains on his shirt. Sheriff, Frederick acknowledged with a nod. I hear you've been looking for us. Hayes closed the door behind him, moving deeper into the shadows of the stable. Been a lot of strange happenings these past couple of days. First those men asking about you, then gunshots reported up in the hills, and now 4 more strangers in town who don't look like they're here for the scenery. They're Barton's men, Frederick said bluntly. Jacob Barton. I'm sure you've heard the name. The sheriff's expression hardened. Every lawman from Colorado to Canada knows the Bartons. You've got history with them, Frederick nodded, briefly explaining his past as a marshal and the vendetta the Barton gang held against him. Hayes listened without interruption, his face growing grimmer with each detail. So that's how it is, he said when Frederick finished. And now they've tracked you here, putting my town in the middle of your war. It's not a war I chose, Sheriff, Frederick replied evenly. But I'm tired of running from it. That's why we need your help. Hayes raised an eyebrow. My help? Against Jacob Barton and his gang? I'm just one man with a tin star, Ellis. We need to get a message to U.S. Marshal James Woodward in Helena, Felicity interjected. He knew Frederick when he wore a badge. If he comes with deputies, we might have a chance of ending this once and for all. Woodward, Hayes mused. Good man, helped me track down a stage robber 2 years back. He studied Frederick for a moment, but Helena's 4 days hard ride from here. Even if I send a telegram from Silver Creek nearest telegraph office, it could be a week or more before Woodward arrives. We don't have a week, Frederick said grimly. Barton's men are already here. The sheriff sighed, pushing back his hat to scratch his forehead. Well, I can't very well turn you over to them, but I also can't let them shoot up my town looking for you. We need to get you somewhere safe until help arrives. My cabin's compromised, Frederick said, and we can't put Mrs. Holloway or her boarders at risk. Hayes thought for a moment, then nodded decisively. The old mining office at the edge of town. Been abandoned since the Silver Creek mine played out last year. It's solid built with a good view of the approach road. I'll post a deputy there and ride for Silver Creek myself to send that telegram. Those men will know something's happening if you leave town, Felicity pointed out. Let me worry about that, Hayes said confidently. I've got a few tricks left for dealing with troublemakers. They waited until dusk before moving to the abandoned mining office, a small but sturdy stone building set back from the main road. Hayes had arranged for supplies to be smuggled in food, water, fresh bandages for Frederick, and additional ammunition. My deputy Johnson will keep watch from the boarding house across the way, Hayes told them as he prepared to leave. Anyone approaches who shouldn't, he'll fire a warning shot. I should be back in 2 days, 3 at the most. Thank you, Sheriff, Frederick said, extending his hand. I know you're taking a risk for a stranger. Hayes shook the offered hand firmly. Miss Chandler's no stranger, and she seems to think you're worth the trouble. That's good enough for me. He tipped his hat to Felicity. Keep him in line, madam, and keep those guns loaded. After Hayes departed, Felicity redressed Frederick's wound while he checked and cleaned their weapons. The mining office was Spartan but defensible, with thick walls and small windows that would be difficult for attackers to breach. How long do you think we'll need to wait here? Felicity asked as they shared a simple meal of jerky, biscuits, and canned peaches. Depends on how soon Barton's men realize we're in town, Frederick replied, his eyes constantly moving to the windows. They're not known for their patience. And what happens when Marshal Woodward arrives? Will you testify against Barton? Frederick nodded slowly. If it comes to that, though Barton would rather die than hang. The gravity of his words hung in the air between them. Felicity reached across the small table, taking his hand, and after, when it's truly over. His fingers intertwined with hers. I meant what I said, Felicity, about staying, about building something here, a home, a future. With me, she asked softly. Only if you'll have me, he replied, his voice equally soft. I'm not much of a catch, a former lawman with enemies, and not much to my name besides a few saved dollars and the clothes on my back. Felicity smiled, squeezing his hand. I'm not interested in your possessions, Frederick Ellis. I'm interested in the man who was willing to ride into the wilderness, injured and outnumbered, to protect a town and a woman he cares about. The tenderness in his eyes as he looked at her made her breath catch. Is that a yes, then, to my not-quite proposal from last night? It's a ask me properly when this is all over, and we'll see, she replied with a teasing smile. I may be scandalous enough to spend unchaperoned nights with you, but I still expect to be wooed according to some semblance of propriety. Frederick's laugh was warm and genuine. Fair enough. I promise a proper proposal on one knee, with a ring once Barton is dealt with. I'll hold you to that, she said, her heart full with a joy that seemed incongruous given their precarious situation. The next day passed with excruciating slowness, the tension building with each hour that ticked by. They kept the curtains drawn and spoke in hushed voices, jumping at every sound from the street. Deputy Johnson appeared briefly at midday, reporting that Barton's men were still in town, growing increasingly agitated as they searched for Frederick. They've been asking questions all over town, he told them. Getting rougher about it too. Had to break up a confrontation at the general store when one of them grabbed Mrs. Peterson's arm. Has anyone talked? Frederick asked, his expression grave. Johnson shook his head. Not that I know of. Folks around here are loyal to their own, and Miss Chandler's well respected. But it's only a matter of time before they start searching buildings one by one. After the deputy left, Felicity found Frederick standing by the window, peering through a narrow gap in the curtains. The strain of waiting was evident in the rigid set of his shoulders, the tension in his jaw. "They won't find us," she said, moving to stand beside him. "And Hayes will be back soon with word from Marshal Woodward." Frederick's expression remained grim. "Barton's men won't wait that long. They know I'm here somewhere, they can feel it, and when they run out of patience." He didn't need to finish the thought. They both knew what would happen if the outlaws decided to force the issue. Innocent townspeople caught in the crossfire, businesses destroyed, lives ruined. "Then we need to draw them away from town," Felicity said, the idea forming even as she spoke. "Give them what they want you, but on our terms, not theirs." Frederick turned to her, his brow furrowed. "What are you suggesting?" "We let them know you're leaving town tonight. Heading back into the hills, they'll follow away from Whispering Pines and its people." "And then what?" he asked, though she could see he was already considering the plan. "I can't outrun them, not in my condition." "No," she agreed, "but we can choose the ground. Set a trap instead of walking into one." Frederick studied her face, a mixture of admiration and concern in his eyes. There's no we in this part of the plan, Felicity. If I'm going to draw them out, I'm doing it alone. And who will stitch you up when you tear your wound open again?" She challenged. "Who will watch your back when you're too weak to stay upright in the saddle?" "Felicity, no," she interrupted firmly. "I didn't save your life 3 times only to let you ride off to die alone. We do this together or not at all." They argued for nearly an hour, Frederick insisting she remain safely in town while Felicity countered every point with stubborn determination. In the end, faced with her unshakable resolve and the logic of her arguments, Frederick reluctantly agreed to her plan. Through Deputy Johnson, they arranged for word to leak to Barton's men that Frederick had been spotted at the livery stable, preparing to flee town under cover of darkness. They would take the east road toward the abandoned mining camp in the foothills, where the terrain offered multiple defensive positions. "If we can hold them off until dawn," Frederick said as they made final preparations, checking weapons and gathering supplies, "Johnson will bring reinforcements from town. Not much, but enough to even the odds until Hayes returns." Felicity nodded, trying to project a confidence she didn't entirely feel. The reality of what they were about to attempt, deliberately drawing 4 armed killers into a confrontation, was settling on her shoulders like a physical weight. Frederick must have sensed her unease, for he set aside his rifle and moved to stand before her, taking her hands in his. "It's not too late to change your mind," he said gently. "No one would think less of you." "I would," she replied simply. "And besides, I've grown rather fond of keeping you alive. I'd like to continue the tradition." His smile was tender as he raised one hand to cup her cheek. "You are the most extraordinary woman I have ever known, Felicity Chandler. And when this is over, I intend to spend the rest of my life proving worthy of you." Under cover of darkness, they slipped out the back door of the mining office where Deputy Johnson waited with their horses. The night was clear and moonlit, not ideal for a stealthy escape, but it would have to do. "Godspeed," Johnson whispered as they mounted. "I'll bring help at first light, just like we planned." They rode east, keeping to the shadows where possible, their senses alert for any sign of pursuit. They had a head start, but it wouldn't last long once Barton's men discovered the bait had been taken. The abandoned mining camp lay 5 miles east of town, nestled in a narrow valley flanked by rocky slopes. Once a bustling operation with nearly 100 workers, it had been deserted for almost a year since the silver vein played out. Now the weathered buildings stood like ghosts in the moonlight, offering both cover and concealment. They dismounted at the edge of the camp, leading their horses to a tumble-down stable where they wouldn't be visible from the approach road. Frederick moved more easily than he had the day before, though Felicity could tell by the careful way he carried himself that his wound still pained him. "The assay office," he said, pointing to a stone building at the center of the camp. "Solid walls, good sight lines. We'll make our stand there if they force the issue." They settled in to wait, positioning themselves where they could watch the road while remaining hidden. Frederick had insisted Felicity take his spare revolver, showing her how to use it, though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. "Just point and squeeze the trigger," he had told her. "But only as a last resort. Stay behind cover and let me handle the shooting." The hours crept by with agonizing slowness. Midnight came and went, then 1 o'clock, then 2. Felicity fought to stay alert, her eyes straining in the darkness for any movement along the road. Maybe they didn't take the bait, she whispered hopefully as the moon began its descent toward the western horizon. Frederick shook his head. They took it. They're just being cautious, probably circling around to approach from multiple directions. He was proven right moments later when the distant sound of hoofbeats reached them not from the direction of town, but from the hills to the north. Frederick tensed, his rifle ready. They're splitting up, he murmured, trying to flank us. More hoofbeats, these from the east. Felicity's heart pounded as she realized they were being surrounded. What do? We let them come closer, Frederick said, his voice calm despite the danger. Let them think their strategy is working. The minutes ticked by, the sounds of their hunters growing nearer. Then suddenly a shot rang out, the bullet splintering wood inches from where they crouched. There, a rough voice shouted. By the assay office, Frederick returned fire, his rifle cracking in the night air. A cry of pain told them his shot had found its mark. Then all hell broke loose as bullets began flying from multiple directions, peppering the building around them. Get inside, Frederick ordered, providing covering fire as Felicity dashed for the assay office door. He followed moments later, slamming the heavy door behind them just as more bullets thudded into the wooden frame. The interior was dark, illuminated only by thin shafts of moonlight through the boarded windows. Frederick moved quickly to one of these openings, breaking away more of the boards to create a firing position. 4 of them, he reported grimly. 2 coming from the north, 2 from the east. One's wounded but still in the fight. Felicity crouched near another window, peering cautiously through a gap in the boards. Can we hold them off until dawn? We'll have to, Frederick replied, firing again as one of the attackers made a dash for a closer position. Another cry of pain suggested he had hit his target. That's 2 wounded. Might make them more cautious. But the Barton gang had not survived this long by being easily deterred. The gunfire intensified, and Felicity could hear the men calling to each other, coordinating their movements to close in on the building. They're trying to get to the back door, Frederick said, moving to cover that approach. Stay on this side, shoot anything that moves. The next hour was a blur of gunfire, shouted threats, and moments of tense silence. Frederick moved from window to window, changing position to keep the attackers guessing about their numbers. Twice, he narrowly avoided bullets that came through the gaps in the boards, showering him with splinters. Felicity did as instructed, watching the approaches and alerting Frederick to any movement she spotted. She had yet to fire her own weapon, but kept it ready, her hands surprisingly steady despite the fear coursing through her. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, Frederick returned to her side, his face streaked with sweat and grime. They're getting desperate, he said quietly. Dawn's coming and they know Johnson will be bringing help soon. Isn't that good? Felicity asked, hoping their ordeal might be nearing its end. Frederick shook his head grimly. It means they'll make one final push, try to rush us before help arrives. As if on cue, a voice called from outside, rough, commanding, filled with menace. Ellis, we know you're in there. Come out now and the woman doesn't have to die with you. Frederick's jaw tightened. Jacob Barton, he said softly. He must have been nearby, came when his men reported finding me. You hear me, Ellis, the voice called again. One chance, that's all you get. Come out now, hands up, or we burn you both out. Frederick glanced at Felicity, his expression torn. They'll do it, he said quietly. They'll set fire to the building. With the dry wood and the oil lamps that were used here, it'll go up like tinder. You can't seriously be considering surrendering, Felicity said, alarmed by the look in his eyes. If it means you walk out of here alive. Yes, I am. Before she could protest further, Frederick moved to the door. Barton, he called. I'm coming out, but the woman goes free. She's got nothing to do with this. Frederick, no. Felicity grabbed his arm, but he gently disentangled himself. It's the only way, he said softly. Johnson will be here soon. You'll be safe. And you'll be dead, she hissed. I didn't save your life 3 times to watch you throw it away now. Outside, Barton's voice came again. Clock's ticking, Ellis. You've got 1 minute before we light this place up. Frederick cupped Felicity's face in his hands, his eyes memorizing every detail as if it might be the last time he saw her. "I love you," he said simply. "I think I have since the first moment I saw you, that's why I have to do this." Before she could respond, he kissed her a desperate, passionate kiss that spoke of all the futures they might have had. Then he was moving away toward the door, his gun held loosely in his hand. "No," Felicity whispered, then louder, "No." A sudden commotion outside interrupted the moment's shouts, the sound of galloping horses, then gunfire that wasn't directed at their building. "It's Johnson," Frederick exclaimed, rushing back to the window, "and he's not alone." Through the gaps in the boards, they could see riders at least a dozen charging into the mining camp, firing as they came. Barton's men scattered, returning fire as they sought cover. "That's not just the deputy," Frederick said, a note of wonder in his voice. "That's Sheriff Hayes and those men with him. Federal marshals," Felicity realized, spotting the distinctive badges catching the first rays of the rising sun. Hayes must have ridden through the night to bring them here. The battle outside was brief but intense. Outnumbered and surrounded, 3 of Barton's men surrendered quickly. But Jacob Barton himself, a bear of a man with a wild beard and wilder eyes, chose to make a last stand, firing madly at the approaching lawman until a hail of bullets cut him down. When the shooting stopped, Frederick cautiously opened the assay office door, keeping Felicity behind him as they emerged into the dawn light. Sheriff Hayes dismounted and approached them, looking weary but satisfied. "Looks like we got here just in time," he said, holstering his gun. "You two all right?" Frederick nodded, his arm around Felicity's shoulders. "Thanks to your timely arrival, I didn't expect to see federal marshals so soon," Hayes grinned. "Got lucky. Marshal Woodward was already in Silver Creek when my telegram arrived." Something about following up on a lead about the Barton gang operating in the territory. A tall, weathered man with a silver star pinned to his vest approached, recognition lighting his face as he saw Frederick. "Ellis, damn, it's good to see you, heard you were dead." "Came close a few times," Frederick admitted, extending his hand to his former colleague. "Closer than I'd like these past few days." Woodward clasped the offered hand warmly. "Well, you can rest easy now. Jacob Barton's dead and the rest of his gang will hang. It's over." The journey back to Whispering Pines was a triumphant one, with Frederick and Felicity riding side by side at the center of the marshal's party. Word of the confrontation had reached town ahead of them, and it seemed the entire population had turned out to witness their return. Mrs. Holloway rushed forward as they dismounted in front of the boarding house, embracing Felicity with tears in her eyes. "My dear girl, when I heard what had happened, that you were out there with those dreadful men shooting at you, I nearly fainted dead away." "I'm fine, Mrs. Holloway," Felicity assured her, returning the embrace. Thanks to Frederick and Sheriff Hayes, the following days were a whirlwind of activity. Marshal Woodward took statements from both Frederick and Felicity about the Barton gang's activities, promising that the surviving members would face justice for their crimes. Frederick's wound was properly treated by Dr. Morrison, who pronounced him lucky to be alive, though it seems Miss Chandler's stitching saved your life. He admitted grudgingly, through it all, Frederick and Felicity were rarely separated, their shared ordeal having cemented a bond that neither wished to break. They spoke often of the future of the land Frederick hoped to purchase, of the home they might build together, of the life they could share once the echoes of violence had faded. 2 weeks after the confrontation at the mining camp, on a warm evening, as the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Frederick invited Felicity to ride with him to the plot of land east of town that he hoped to make his own. It was beautiful, a gentle slope leading down to a clear stream, with pine-covered hills rising in the distance and enough open ground for a small herd of cattle. A single ancient oak stood near where Frederick envisioned building a house, its spreading branches offering shade and shelter. "Carter agreed to sell it to me," he told her as they stood beneath the oak. "Said my actions helped make the territory safer for honest ranchers. He even offered to let me pay in installments." "It's perfect," Felicity said, picturing the home that could stand there, the gardens she might plant, the children who might play beneath the oak's branches. When will you start building? Frederick turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. That depends on you, he said softly. On me. He nodded, his eyes filled with tenderness and hope. I made you a promise to ask properly when it was all over. Slowly, he lowered himself to one knee, still holding her hands. Felicity Chandler, from the moment I saw you, I knew you were someone special. What I didn't know then was that you would become the most important person in my life, my savior, my friend, the woman I love more than I ever thought possible. Felicity's heart swelled as he continued, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. I have nothing grand to offer you, just this land, these hands, and a heart that is yours entirely. But if you'll have me, I promise to spend every day of our lives trying to be worthy of the love you've shown me. Will you marry me, Felicity? Will you build this dream with me? Tears of joy blurred her vision as she nodded. Yes, she whispered, then louder, yes, Frederick Ellis, I will marry you and build this dream and love you for all the days we have together. He rose to his feet, drawing her into his arms with a gentleness that belied the strength she knew he possessed. His kiss was a promise, a beginning, a homecoming all at once. You know, she said when they finally parted, a teasing light in her eyes, when I found you on that cabin floor with your gun beside you, I told you that you weren't dying like that. I had no idea what I was starting. Frederick laughed, the sound free and joyous in a way she had never heard before. You started everything, Felicity, a new life, a future, hope. He kissed her again softly, and I intend to thank you for it every day for the rest of our lives. They were married that autumn, beneath the spreading branches of the oak tree on their land. The whole town turned out for the celebration, Sheriff Hayes standing as Frederick's best man while Mrs. Holloway wept happily in the front row of hastily assembled chairs. By the following spring, the framework of their house stood proud against the Montana sky, and Felicity had news that made Frederick's face glow with a joy she had once thought he might never know. A baby, he whispered, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. Our baby. The first of many, I hope, she replied, covering his hand with her own. This house will need filling with laughter and little feet. Their daughter, Elizabeth, was born the following winter, her eyes the same summer sky blue as her father's. 2 years later, she was joined by a brother, William, who inherited his mother's determined spirit and compassionate heart. As the years passed, the Ellis Ranch prospered, becoming known throughout the territory for its fine horses and Frederick's fair dealing. Felicity continued her work as a midwife, bringing new life into the world while raising her own growing family. Their home became a gathering place for friends and travelers alike, always with an extra place at the table and a warm welcome for those in need. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep and they sat together on the porch watching the stars emerge above the eastern hills, Frederick would take Felicity's hand and press a kiss to her palm. Do you ever think about that day? He would ask. When you found me dying on my cabin floor? Only every day, she would reply, leaning her head against his shoulder. It was the day I found not just a wounded man, but the future I never knew I was looking for. And Frederick would smile, drawing her closer as the night deepened around their home, the home they had built together from love, courage, and the refusal to let death have the final word.